The setting is early 1800s America, and at this point, the system of slavery had been around for over 2 centuries. And while some early abolitionists began to challenge this practice, their efforts were still relatively limited to focusing on ideas of gradual emancipation or sending Negroes to Africa. And in response to this challenge, some white Americans were willing to present any intellectual or invented argument to persuade people to their point of view. And this is because many of the whites, they had an economic or a psychological interest in keeping slavery alive. So in this commentary, we're going to hear some of their points. And now for us to do so, we're going to read from the 1971 book called The Black Image in the White Mind by Dr. George M. Fredrickson. So let's go on here and turn to page 43, where he writes this. Prior to the 1830s, black subordination was the practice of white Americans, and the inferiority of the Negro was undoubtedly a common assumption. Black at the bottom as inferior and white on the top as superior. These were the concepts attached to certain people and accepted by society. And this understanding that people with various shades of rich brown skin made up primarily of recent African ancestry were those labeled as blacks, and they were said to be the inferior as most Americans understood them to be. But open assertions of permanent inferiority were exceedingly rare. Intellectuals and prominent figures of society understood them to be inferior at their present time, but many of them did not voice their opinion whether or not they would stay this way forever, right? This is dealing with the debate on Negro natural inferiority. Let's keep reading. It took the assault of the abolitionists to unmask the cant about a theoretical human equality that coexisted with Negro slavery and racial discrimination, and to force the practitioners of racial oppression to develop a theory that accorded with their behavior. Well before the rise of radical abolitionism, however, spokesmen for the Lower South gave notice that they were prepared to defend slavery as an institution against any kind of attack that might develop. In the 1820s, the leadership of the major cotton-producing states made it clear that a national colonization effort was unacceptable because, in their view, slavery was an essential and constitutionally protected local institution, which was no concern of the federal government or the non-slaveholding states. The national colonization effort he's referring to was the freeing of the enslaved and shipping them off to Africa to start a new colony. This effort, supported by the American Colonization Society, was proposed as a way of relieving blacks from an oppressive white society. And on top of that, it was to dodge the new social problems they predicted would arise from the newly freed blacks in the American society. Now, the defenders of slavery, they argued that this plan was unacceptable, and that was because slavery was constitutionally protected, and therefore the government and other people alike should mind their own business. Here we go. These apologists for black servitude characteristically answered the colonizationists by agreeing with them that emancipation on the soil was unthinkable, and then proceeding to point out not only that colonization was impractical as a program of Negro removal, but also that its very agitation was a danger to the security of a slave society because the discipline of the plantation. So slavery defenders agreed with colonizationists that it wouldn't be a good idea to free them and keep them on American soil. But they had a completely different solution than shipping them off to Africa, which was this. A permanent and rigid slave system, it was argued, was both economically necessary in the rice and cotton growing areas and vital as a system of control for a potentially dangerous black population. Their solution was to keep them in the pit as permanent slaves, you see? Since we all agree that it's not in everyone's best interest to free them into American society, let's just keep them working in the field so they don't become free and terrorize the society with violence. This is what Dr. Fredrickson is talking about. Such a viewpoint soon triumphed in all the slaveholding states. In 1831 and 1832, the Virginia legislature debated a colonization proposal that might have opened the way to gradual emancipation, but its defeat marked the end of a serious search, even in the Upper South, for some way to set slavery on the path to extinction. After the Virginia debate, Professor Thomas R. Dew of William and Mary College, speaking for the victorious pro-slavery faction,
set forth the most thorough and comprehensive justification of the institution that the South had yet produced.
Now let's hear the good professor's justification.
His justification of slavery rested first of all on the contention that servitude had been a necessary stage of human progress, and hence could not be regarded as evil in itself.
I do understand his argument and his position, and when you examine it closely, you can see that the argument is compelling, and that's because human beings began civilization with slaves, right? There's an inherently exploitive trait within humans, and some of them act on this urge to take advantage of people for their own gain. But exploitation of people, which in one form manifests as slavery, appears to be a major cause in society having the development, technology, and the progress that it has, right? It can be interpreted as a wicked thing for sure, but the universe itself is both wicked and righteous, both evil and good, dark and light, both black and white, and for whatever reason, it uses both sides to create balance within existence. So the professor argued that slavery was just part of human progress, although he doesn't interpret it as an evil, right? Here we go.
He then went on to argue that the concrete circumstances of Southern life required the institution and that no set of abstract principles should be invoked to obscure the basic fact that the Negro was not prepared for freedom.
He's talking about the Negro's consciousness wasn't prepared for freedom. The way the Negro believed and behaved wasn't fitting for freedom, in his opinion.
In his discussion of Negro character and prospects, Dew did not deviate forthrightly and insistently from traditional quasi-environmentalist assumptions about the nature of most racial differences.
And environmentalist assumptions were that differences in behavior between those called blacks and whites were due to external factors such as geography, culture, and upbringing. And so blacks were intellectually inferior due to the culture of slavery and the society which prevented them the opportunity to intellectually develop in certain areas. And the Negro character was looked at through the same environmentalist lens. But the author is saying that Dew's position was a quasi or a somewhat similar to the environmentalist approach, which means that it wasn't fully that. And this is why.
Although at the beginning of his essay he described Negroes as
differing from us in color and habits and vastly inferior in the scale of civilization,
he did not deal consistently with the question whether this inferiority resulted from innate character or from the habits engendered by a long exposure to inhibiting circumstances.
The blacks,
he wrote,
have now all the habits and feelings of slaves.
The repetitive behavior and emotional responses that blacks learned over the century completely reflected a slave. This is what this is saying.
The whites have those of masters.
Which is the complete opposite of how he described the blacks. The character of the blacks represented the oppressed and the white, the oppressor. This is what he's referring to.
The prejudices are formed, and mere legislation cannot improve them.
The white opinion about blacks is deeply rooted, and simply changing the law is not going to help anything at this point. That's what he's talking about.
Declare the Negroes of the South free tomorrow, and vain will be your decree until you have prepared them for it.
And why is he saying that it's vanity to set the Negroes free? One of the reasons he just told us a moment ago. He believed that the blacks had habits and feelings of a slave, right? Which would not work in a free society. And so it would be vain to release them without properly preparing their consciousness for this new world. And on top of that, the whites were way too prejudiced and violent to allow the blacks to make any progress. And Dew is seeing a major problem with these two issues when they're added together. Now watch this.
The law would make them freemen, and custom or prejudice, we care not which you call it, would degrade them to the condition of slaves.
That's coming from the whites acting from the position of the master and keeping blacks in a condition of being a slave even if they were legally freed.
Such a prediction, he indicated, was merely an application of the rule that
each one should remain in society in the condition in which he has been born and trained, and not try to mount too fast without preparation.
But Dew could also describe black behavior as if it were predetermined by innate racial traits, for he contradicted his suggestion that Negro characteristics were simply acquired habits of servility by arguing, somewhat obscurely, that the supposed indolence of free blacks resulted from
an inherent and intrinsic cause.
So the indolence or perceived laziness was viewed by Dew to be natural. And when a general statement is made like this, it's best to clarify what it is exactly we're talking about when we're saying lazy, because no one is 100% lazy at anything. People are mostly lazy at the things that they don't like doing or things that they're unskilled at, right? But at this time, the indolence that he's referring to is general labor, which included manual work. And many people at this time, they claim or made these same claims about the blacks, right? Now let's keep going.
And when he asserted that
the free black will work nowhere except by compulsion,
he decisively parted company with the colonizationists. If Dew was a transitional figure in the general defense of slavery because he combined arguments from expediency with hints of a conservative, pro-slavery theory of society, he was equally transitional as a racial theorist because of his vacillation between arguments for black inferiority drawn from a perception of the force of habits, customs, and prejudices, and those suggesting that a permanency of racial type justified enslavement. By the middle of the 1830s, the full impact of the abolitionist argument had been felt in the South, and Dew's ambiguous treatment of the racial factor and his contention that slavery was sometimes justified by circumstances no longer provided Southern apologists with what they regarded as a fully adequate defense of the institution. The abolitionists' charge that slavery was inherently sinful was now met increasingly by the unequivocal claim that slavery was a positive good. Furthermore, their practical assertion of racial equality as something to be achieved in the United States and not through colonization inspired pro-slavery spokesmen to clarify their racial views and to assert as a major part of their case the unambiguous concept of inherent Negro inferiority.
Here we go.
South Carolinians led the way. In 1835, Governor George McDuffie told the South Carolina General Assembly that the Negroes were
destined by Providence.
That means preordained by whichever god they were worshiping. So Negroes were made with the intention in God's mind
for slavery, and that this was made evident not only by the color of their skin, but also by
the intellectual inferiority and natural improvidence of this race.
Using the tool of God to amplify the argument of blacks being fit for slavery, and presenting his proof of this claim by describing them as intellectually inferior and improvident or lacking proper judgment regarding the future. Here we go.
They were, he indicated,
unfit for self-government of any kind, and in all respects physical, moral, and political, inferior to millions of the human race.
They're just at the bottom of the bottom, right? Take it all in as we continue the shadow work. Here we go.
McDuffie professed astonishment that anyone should
suppose it possible to reclaim the African race from their destiny.
He thought that it was a wild thing that anyone, especially the white abolitionist, would even try to take any of those of recent African ancestry away from the destiny ordained by God, which was what?
As slaves or subjects of some other form of absolute despotism.
That's the destiny Mr. McDuffie is referring to. That blacks were supposed to be ordained by God to be slaves, or the subjects of some other form of absolute despotism, which means under the power of some other ruler, or simply they needed to be governed by some other people other than themselves, right? Now pay attention because we've got more.
The Charleston lawyer William Drayton said much the same thing the following year in a pamphlet attacking the abolitionists.
And what did he say?
Personal observation must convince every candid man that the Negro is constitutionally indolent, voluptuous, and prone to vice.
That's indolent or lazy in working, voluptuous, and in this context it means excessive sensual pleasures, and prone to vice, meaning inclined to do unethical or immoral things, right? Here's what else he said.
That his mind is heavy, dull, and unambitious, and that the doom that has made the African in all ages and countries a slave is the natural consequence of the inferiority of his character.
You see that? That's how greasy Mr. Drayton was talking. And there's more.
In 1837, John C. Calhoun made his famous defense of slavery before the Senate of the United States and showed how important racial doctrines really were in the new and militant defense of servitude which developed in the 1830s.
And here's what he said.
I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, The relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good.
Why did he say the relation between these two was a positive good? He's probably thinking along the lines of the Governor McDuffie, right? That the blacks were unfit for self-government and they were best suited to be in the inferior position to the whites. And if he added the God-ordained aspect to this case, then ooh-wee. Then it would, of course, be a positive good for everyone. Here we go.
It was thus in tandem with the concept of slavery as a positive good that the doctrine of permanent black inferiority began its career as a rationale, first for slavery itself and later for post-emancipation forms of racial oppression. The attitudes that underlay the belief that the Negro was doomed by nature itself to perpetual slavishness and subordination to the whites were not new, nor was the doctrine itself if considered as a popular belief that lacked intellectual respectability. But when asserted dogmatically and with an aura of philosophical authority by leading Southern spokesmen and their Northern supporters in the 1830s, it became, for the first time, the basis of a worldview, an explicit ideology around which the beneficiaries of white supremacy could organize themselves and their thoughts.
Very powerful words and thoughts coming from these people at this time, right? And this is regardless if one sees them as true, untrue, or half true, or whatever, right? That's not the point. The point is that these types of ideas, they have tremendous impact on people's lives, especially when they're planted and they're flourishing in the garden of people's minds, right? Very powerful stuff for sure. But stay tuned, because in the next part, we're also going to finish more on the commentary in this section. And we're going to continue with the shadow work and continue climbing the consciousness out of the pit, right? So right now, I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.